G'day, and welcome back to another episode of ATA's Econ Talk. ATA, this is brought to you by the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. That's what ATA stands for. I'm your host, ATA's Chief Economist, John Humphreys, and as you can see today, I am not alone. Sharing the stage with me today is Gene Tunny from Adept Economics, the founder and director of Adept Economics, economic consulting firm. And one of the all-round gurus of the Queensland economic commentary. Welcome to the show, Gene.
Pleasure, John. Good to be on with you, mate.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have some fun. Now, Gene and I agree on a lot, but I got to say, agreeing with people, I think, makes less interesting TV. So I'm hoping we find things we can disagree about. I can't promise you because we don't know exactly what each other's going to say, but hopefully we can find a way to argue for your viewing pleasure. This show is live, it's unscripted, and it's interactive. By interactive, I mean it's going out to YouTube and Facebook. You can chuck in comments, and we hope you do. We are happy to get distracted. If you ask questions, give commentary, write some criticism, we're happy to interact and go down rabbit holes. Because, as I said, this is unscripted. We often don't know what we're going to say, which can make it fun or dangerous. Speaking of where it's being shown, this is currently going to YouTube and Facebook. It's going to the ATA's channel, Australian Taxpayers Alliance. It's going to my personal channel, John Humphreys, and also it's being streamed to the Good Source. So please make sure you go and give all of those organizations a like. Find us on YouTube, find us on Facebook, give us a like, give us a follow. And if you're watching now, please consider putting in a comment and sharing this around so we can get a few people into the chat and having a bit of a good time. So this is also just to remind the housekeeping, 7 p.m. Queensland time, but I understand some people have not yet fully evolved into being a Queenslander and still suffer the indignity of coming from other states. Look, I don't blame you personally. It's probably your parents' fault. But if you do suffer from being a New South Welshman or a Victorian, 8 p.m., our regular live spot, Tuesday, 8 p.m. for these Southerners, 7 p.m. for Queensland, and if you're in Adelaide or Perth, you have to work it out yourself because I can't think like that. So welcome, join us every week. We've had a bit of a time off, so there's been lots of things we haven't discussed, and we don't have enough time to catch up on it all. But one thing I think might be worth touching on is what is the state of the economy? I normally ran through some recent ABS data drops in previous EconChats. There's been too much new data for me to do that. So I thought we'd just do some sort of summary of where we are and where we're going. So, Gene, what is the state of Australia's economy?
Well, I think the best way to describe it, John, is that we are certainly slowing down. So we've had a remarkable post-COVID recovery. It was just absolutely extraordinary. And that was related to all the additional money that was dumped into the economy. And that's driven a lot of drove a lot of additional spending and then higher inflation. And now with the Reserve Bank having to increase interest rates and that's starting to have an impact, we are starting to see conditions moderate, as they say. So we'll see a slowdown. We're seeing a slowdown of some kind. There was new data from NAB, their business survey today, that suggests yes, conditions are slowing and maybe there's less inflationary pressure in the economy. I mean, who knows? I mean, it's so difficult to forecast. So much depends on expectations, how much people expect inflation to be. And I think we still need to see how those interest rates impact on the economy. What happens when fixed interest rate mortgages, when they reset at higher rates, then we will, just know what's going to happen with the economy. But I think certainly it's going to be slowing down this year. I just see a comment that government spending isn't slowing down. It's certainly not slowing down as much as it needs to reduce the government's contribution to inflation. So I agree with that there. But generally, I think we'll see a moderation or slowing down in the economy over this year.
Well, I certainly agree with that, but there's maybe a few things to unpack. Firstly, I think the bounce back simply was the response to everyone reopening their doors. So I don't give the government spending quite as much credit as you do, perhaps. I think it's inevitable there was going to be a bounce back under any scenario. If you force all the doors shut, you'll have a dip. If you allow the doors to open, people will come back into the stores. But yeah, I take your point. That would certainly contribute, especially the way the data is collected and added up these days. I've got a slightly different...
John, yeah, I was just...
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, I mean, you don't think that all of the additional money that was dumped into bank accounts, the people withdrawing money from super, there's this wealth impact of that. And now, I mean, prices have to catch up. I mean, we've got all of these people with additional money that have been able to spend, temporarily. Okay, so the economy is going to have to adjust to that. That's what I think is a big part of the story. The reopening, certainly, but then also just the fact that there's all of this additional money and making people temporarily, having more to spend, and there's almost it was almost a helicopter drop of money in a way. It was extraordinary. I mean, that's the way I see it. But open to your thoughts.
I don't think that's crazy. The helicopter drop is a pretty good analogy given the impact it's had. That's often the story that's taught to us in undergrad economics, with to try and think through the way of monetary policy can impact the economy. The helicopter drops money. Firstly, you have money in your pocket, you go and spend, but it also means instead of $100 chasing 100 goods, you now have $110 chasing 100 goods, and that's where you get 10% inflation. And I think that inflation has kicked in perhaps quicker than the experts were hoping, although maybe they were just hoping it wouldn't kick in. But look, it's either way, putting the quibble about why the bounce back, I think the more interesting thing is looking forward. I think we both agree, probably with nearly everyone else, that there's going to be a continued slowdown in the economy. I wonder whether we may already be in something of a recession. And I understand the technical definition of recession is two quarters of negative GDP growth. I understand that's the technical definition everywhere, unless you are a US Democrat and you're suffering that situation, and so you arbitrarily change the definition for political reasons. But putting that aside, for everyone else, I get that. I guess I'm going to quibble a few ways. One is there's 0.8% nominal GDP growth, but nominal's a daft thing to look at. So firstly, 0.6% real GDP growth, because you should adjust for prices. And secondly, when people talk about a recession, what they're really interested in is how it impacts people. So we really should, and this is a big bugbear of mine, I've talked about this on previous EconChats, we really should be looking at per capita GDP. And that's still going up, I grant you that. So that's 0.4. But sometimes you have per capita GDP negative while GDP is positive. And I think it's very cheeky for commentators to call that positive growth while people are getting poorer. But the other thing, I think I mentioned this to you earlier offline, the latest GDP stats actually show that Victoria and South Australia are already at zero or negative growth. So that's one thing is averages can be misleading. My stupid quip is if you're standing there with one hand in the freezer and one hand in a fire, your average temperature might be nice, but you are not comfortable, right? So sometimes it can be useful. Sometimes it's worth unpacking. And if somebody is currently living in Victoria or South Australia, they may well be living through, for all intents and purposes, a recession. And we're just saying, don't worry, it's not a recession, because if we average your situation with a Queenslander, it's all good. Well, that's cold comfort to someone in Adelaide. So the other one that I think is interesting here is it's not clear that GDP can be a useful stat. It's not clear it's the best stat for well-being. Net national income adjusts for depreciation, and it adjusts for the fact that we care about Australians, not just anyone who happens to be in Australia. And when you make that adjustment, net national income was going down 2% on the last data drop. So I think there's look, I agree the economy is slowing. I wonder though whether perhaps we're already there. I mean, the GDP data was holding up through the spending from the helicopter effect, as you mentioned, not from investment. People aren't investing. Profits are going down. Investment is stagnating. I think I'm a little bit worried about where we're trending for the next year.
Yeah, I think there are big concerns for sure, John, and there are some warnings out there. I think Chris Joy from Coolabah Capital Investments, he's been very concerned about the impact of these interest rates, given that the interest rate increases we've seen, even though you think, oh, well, it's only gone up to, it's risen 3 percentage points from 0.1 to 3.1%, the cash rate. And you think, well, so what? I mean, people should be able to handle that, but because the banks were supposed to be testing an increase in interest rates of a similar sort of magnitude, or 2.5% or whatever it was. So you think, well, people should be able to adjust to that. The problem is that they've taken on so much debt because all of the extra credit that was available led to all the additional borrowing and all the additional money chasing housing. And we had this housing boom, and people have taken on these huge mortgages. And so, yeah, there could be a lot of households in trouble. And so people like Chris are very worried about where the economy is going. You've got a clip there, have you?
Apologies. I was battling with the technology here, and some auto-played video came up. This was just leading into your point about the interest rate changes. I thought it was an interesting piece of context. As you were saying, interest rates have gone up, and not really a huge amount by historical standards. So I thought that might be an interesting piece of historical context. Although, as you say, if people have over-leveraged themselves on the assumption of low interest rates, the fact that we're still historically relatively low is cold comfort for the impact it's going to have on the economy. But anyway, I thought that was an interesting little graphical visualization for people to understand this current situation. That's quite a significant uptick in the end compared to where we start. But compared to history, we're still in a normal-ish situation. I got to say, I do think that the increase in interest rates, we may not have seen how they fully play out yet. At the same time, I don't think they were a mistake. There's a lot of commentary about how the damage they're going to do to the economy. All right, fair enough. But this is the only possible consequence, the only responsible possible consequence from there just being too much money being created, right? The government spending too much money, the central banks creating too much money. That helicopter we talked about before was simply throwing out too much money. And the only long-term consequences from that can be we either just have inflation and then try to print our way out of that and further inflation, print our way out of that, further inflation, and then it eventually still doesn't work. Or we bite the bullet now, fix inflation, and get back to a stable currency. So it is going to bite. It's going to be something to factor in. I think some people hear that and they think therefore it was the wrong thing to do. It's not fun. I have a mortgage. I don't want to see it. It's hurting me. But I think if I abstract from my personal situation, I think it was the responsible thing to do. Now, what's your take on that? We're getting a bit distracted. We wanted to talk about other things, and we will.
Well, I think it's clear now that the RBA acted too late, and Phil Lowe possibly misled Australians toward the end of the year before when he was saying that their central case scenario. So there are all the caveats there. Oh, it's our central case scenario. They were suggesting that they may not lift interest rates till 2024. So I think, the RBA stuffed up really, and probably should have been raising sooner. They kept rates too low, too long. That encouraged additional borrowing, additional credit, additional heat into the economy, into the housing market, and then they really had to jack them up quickly from May to December last year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of blame that can be thrown at the RBA, and indeed I think they are primarily responsible. I just think some people are blaming them for increasing the rates now. I think the big error they did was keeping them too low for too long and then waiting too long before they started increasing them. But either way, we're still kind of screwed. So whichever way you slice it. Look, I wanted to, I constantly say I'll try to make these quick, and then I constantly have too much fun and the episodes go for too long. But I want to dive into one of the issues. We have the format for today after our little chat about the economy. I've got a topic that I'll rant about, and then we can chat. And then Gene has a topic that he can talk about eloquently. I rant, he talks eloquently. And then we can chat about, I've thrown you under the bus, Gene. Now you have to be eloquent. So the issue I wanted to raise, and this is something that maybe needs a little bit of context and background. It might seem weird to some. Stephen Crowder and the DailyWire have been at war with each other. This might seem like a strange thing for us to talk about in Australia on an economics discussion, but I think there's an interesting economic take. So some background on this. Steve Crowder and the Daily Wire are arguably two of the most, maybe the two most important commentators in the conservative alternative media space. Right? The Daily Wire has set up the biggest alternative media company floating around, and Stephen Crowder, I think, is the largest single non-left commentator on politics. He's a comedian, late night host, although I think his late night show is actually during the day. So I don't know how it's a late night show, but it's anyway. Steve Crowder, 6 million followers on YouTube, massive show. Daily Wire includes names like Ben Shapiro, Candace Owens, Andrew Klavan, Michael Knowles, Matt Walsh, the guy that made that documentary, What is a Woman? So quite a significant organization, both in the alt media space. They generally agree, and they were until quite recently friends or friendly allies in that sort of conservative small government space. Recently, Steve Crowder left his old employer, was looking for new contracts, was given an offer by the Daily Wire, or an offer, a term sheet. They started a negotiation to try and hire Stephen Crowder. That fell through at the time. And then just recently, Stephen Crowder has come out and said that the Daily Wire is an evil organization because of the way they frame their contracts. The Daily Wire came out and released the details of the contract and said that they didn't think it was that bad. Steve Crowder then, after that, did another video where he released the recording. He secretly recorded the CEO of Daily Wire and showed their discussion, which was talking about the nature of the contracts, which basically confirmed most of the stuff that the Daily Wire had previously said. If you have been following this at home, if I'd set this up earlier and I knew how, I'd chuck up a poll so everyone could vote. I'd be quite curious. Feel free to chuck in the comments what your opinion is. This is really splitting the non-left online commentary scene. There is a lot of animosity going around. Stephen Crowder and his supporters are very angry at the Daily Wire for the nature of their contract. Supporters of the Daily Wire are angry at Stephen Crowder for attacking the Daily Wire first, and then for secretly recording and releasing a private conversation. So there's a lot of animosity going on in there, and there's a lot to be said. And as usual, I have a lot of opinions, but I'm not here to share most of my opinions on that issue, other than I think there's an interesting little economics lesson we can take from some of the discussion going on about the nature of this contract. And I think if there was a bit more nuanced understanding of how these contracts can be framed, it can actually shed some light onto the discussion and the debate and the animosity. But even if you don't think that's true, it's an opportunity to learn a little bit about wage contracts and different ways of framing them and the issues of expected value and risk-adjusted expected value and the equivalence between them. Let's just check if there's any comments coming in here on whether people are agreeing or not. Interested in my well, you'll be able to probably read it between the lines as I go forward. I'm not trying to hide it, but my point isn't my take here. My point is the economics of the wage contracts. James Brown, they weren't forcing him to take it. No, they weren't. Look, I also just like playing devil's advocate. So I guess if everyone has one opinion, I might just take the other because it's what I do. They weren't forcing him to take it. I think Stephen Crowder's response would be, no, but if they create an industry standard of really shitty contracts, then that's going to be hampering the industry long term. So I think it is worthwhile unpacking that question, right? They didn't force him to take it and he didn't take it, but it's still worthwhile unpacking the question of what should these wage contracts look like? And how could they look? And is there any virtue or lack of virtue in any of the approaches? Eddie says they're all conservative Inc. Mark Dice is the one to listen to. Mark Dice has some interesting takes. I think one of the most nuanced deep dives in this is a channel that I hadn't actually watched before. So this isn't normally a channel I've been spruiking because I don't really know them. It's called The Actual Justice Warrior. And I think he has quite a nuanced take, and you can go and check that one out if you're curious. But anyway, back into my point here. The debate basically comes down to, they say, Stephen Crowder says it's not about money. I'm going to tell you, I think it is, and I think it's provable that it is. It comes down to how you should remunerate people who join a media company. So this is Steve Crowder wanted to join DailyWire, the media company, and his broader point is other new people coming in. How should they be paid, right? What should be the payment system? And there's a couple of different ways you can be paid. One that everyone listening to this is probably quite used to is you can just get a wage, right? And that means your income as the employee, your income is unrelated to the revenue of the business you're in. Or other than if they go broke, if the business goes bust, you could get fired. But putting that aside, if you're on a normal wage, your wage is unrelated. So it's fixed. We call that the fixed wage approach. Another approach, and even if most people are on a fixed wage, but even if you are, you probably are aware that you could have incentive packages where you could be paid a fixed percentage of the revenue that your company gets, right? So if they get $2 revenue, you could get paid $1. If they get $1 million revenue, you could be paid $500,000. That's if you have a 50% payment incentive plan. So this is two options. One is fixed pay and one is variable pay. So I'll see if I can bring this up here without accidentally playing another video. So this is, let's see. I don't know if I can point to this. Tell me, can you see that arrow I'm putting on the screen, Gene? You can?
Yeah, I can see that. Yep, right. Yep.
So this is down on the x-axis here. You have sales. This is a generic video, a generic slide I've taken from elsewhere. So it doesn't say revenue here. But on the x-axis, for this case, it would be the revenue that you're bringing your business, the revenue you're bringing, that Steve Crowder is bringing into DailyWire, right? So that's the revenue. And then on the y-axis here, you have the wage you're paid. So this is for some random manager. In your mind, just replace manager with Stephen Crowder. And what one option is, you could simply be paid a wage, in which case it's fixed. Here they got an example of 120,000? 120,000 a year fixed. If the company makes zero, you get 120. If the company makes 6 million, you get 120,000. If they make anywhere in between, you get 120,000. It is fixed. That's how it's graphically represented here with just this vertical line. And then another way is you could be paid purely on incentives. So a purely variable wage. So if the company makes zero, if Steve Crowder brings zero into DailyWire, he gets paid zero. And as the company gets more revenue, his wage would go up. This is the commission system. So you can see these two systems. Interestingly, in Stephen Crowder's live stream with Tim Pool earlier today, Australian time, last night, American time, he actually said that he thought both of these systems would be appropriate for a media company. He said, it's fine. If DailyWire just wanted to give me a wage, that's fine. If DailyWire just wanted to pay a commission, that's fine. But there are other ways of structuring a wage deal, right? These are the two most extreme options. There are other ways of structuring it. So, well, getting this wrong. So here's another option of how you could structure it. So by the way, just going back here, one option is you could have a minimum pay, say 50,000, and then that would stay 50,000 through to here, and then you could have an incentive pay afterwards. So that's like a fixed baseline, and then a percentage on top. So that's like a third option. And then a fourth option here is you could have tiered, like steps. So you'd have the baseline pay, and then once they hit a certain KPI, you get a bonus. So lots of people have this sort of pay structure as well, right? A baseline pay plus bonuses if you hit KPIs. And then another set of KPIs, and you get another bonus, and going on up like that. Now, fundamentally, all of these payment structures, they're all different, right? They're different ways to remunerate someone, but you can make them all equivalent by tweaking the amounts. Right? There's a concept called expected value, which is the value you're talking about times the probability of it happening. So with a fixed wage, in this example, 120,000. What's your expected value? It's 120,000, right? The number that you could get times the probability, 100%. So 120,000 times 100%, 120,000. What you could get is you could be paid up to 200,000, or just say, to make it simple, let's say you could get paid $200,000, but there's a 60% chance that'll happen and a 40% chance you won't. What's the expected value? 200,000 times 60. I apologize for the people having to do the maths in their head at home as we go, but that also has an expected value of 120,000. So you can see you can get to equal expected values multiple different ways. Now, it can be hard to actually calculate the expected value of this line. Well, it's a weighted average. It's not that hard, but it's hard for me to talk it through live now without a whiteboard. So, but trust me, you can do it. You can work out an expected value for any different style. You could work out the expected value of this, right? So this might be $20, $30, and $40, the three different tiers. And if they're all equally likely, then the expected value is $30. Right? So you can work out the expected values. That's not quite the correct thing to be comparing, because expected values, we assume people like $10 the same as they like $10, but these different payment structures also come with different levels of risk, which is why what we need to look at, and what people tend to when they look in this area, is the risk-adjusted expected value, which is quite a mouthful. So normally I'll just call it the expected value here, but the risk-adjusted expected value means that if you ask someone to take on more risk, you have to compensate them more. So the expected value of a risky system would need to be higher than the expected value of a riskless system for you to be indifferent between the two, for you to find them equally beneficial to you. All right, so this is the risk-adjusted expected value. And there's several different ways you can structure the remuneration, your pay. It could be fixed, it could be variable, it could be variable with a minimum, or it could be stepped, as you can see here on this graph. But you can make them all equivalent. And you can make them all so they have the same risk-adjusted expected value. So they bring the worker the same amount of utility. So they bring the worker the same amount of benefit. Right? It is possible to find a number that make the different systems equivalent. Now, you might have a very strong preference for one system, but that just means to get you to take the other system is they'll have to give you a very high number. So you may want a variable pay, but if they offer you $1 trillion on a fixed contract, you'll eventually find a number. That's a silly example, but you get the idea. Right? So you can find equivalence between all of these. What the DailyWire was offering Crowder, and then also Crowder's main concern is what they were offering other people, is this stepped model. This model you can see right here. This is the model that they are offering Stephen Crowder and their other talent. And interestingly, Crowder says that he's fine with the fixed wage model, he's fine with the variable wage model, but he is outraged and offended beyond belief to the degree of burning bridges and going to war because there is a stepped remuneration model, which is rather odd given all of these systems can be made to come back to the same risk-adjusted expected value. So it's one oddity here. So to use the example of his contract a bit specifically, it's been talked about the $50 million offer, and I understand that's not his wage, right? So a bunch of money would have to come out for production costs, etc. But for the purposes of our maths, the purposes of this econ lesson, it could $50 million contract remuneration. That's actually this top line here. So I think one part of the problem of all of this has been the way the contract was structured. But you'll note as I run through this, you could have worded the exact same contract in a slightly different way. It would mean the exact same thing. And I wonder whether people would have interpreted it differently. So the contract he had is he gets 50 million, but if he falls under the KPIs, it can go down to, at the bottom here, if he got kicked off all the platforms, down to 20 million. Now, I'm ignoring a couple of other clauses just to keep the maths nice and easy, but this is the kicked off the platforms. So you lose 10% if you're off Spotify, 10% off Facebook, 20% off Apple, 20% off YouTube. That was the way it was structured. And that 60% off 50 gets you down to 20. So there was this penalty of getting kicked off platforms in the contract. And that would take the $50 million offer down to 20 million. And that sounded, it sounded pretty dodgy. Indeed, I think those numbers probably are too high, but he should have negotiated those down. But it sounds egregious if you get penalized. Consider this. You could have worded the exact same contract this way. Steve Crowder, we're going to offer you a $20 million contract. 20 million, not 50, right? Because remember, Stephen says it's not the money. The money doesn't matter. A $20 million contract. But we'll give you a bonus. So start at the bottom and we'll give you a bonus. If you're on Apple, an extra 20%. If you're on Facebook, an extra 10%. All the way up to, if you hit all the KPIs, you get up to 50 million. So you'll notice that's exactly the same thing. But one says it's 50 million, minus 60% down to 20, potentially somewhere in the middle. And the other one says start at 20, but you could go up to 50. The exact same situation, worded two different ways. Part of me wonders whether if it was worded the second way, people would be less angry. Sorry, I'm just seeing some comments come in. I'll get to the comments as we get to the end. So that's one issue here. The other way you could, to put some numbers on this situation, so Crowder has offered a step contract of somewhere between 20 and 50. So as I said before, you can make equivalence between all of these different styles of remuneration. what they potentially could have offered with roughly similar, risk-adjusted expected values might be an offer of 30 or 40 million flat. So they could have offered that, and that would have got potentially the equivalent risk-adjusted expected value, but then he'd have to be accepting that 35 million, and there's nothing he could do to increase it. They also could have given him a variable option where it was 20 million base plus X% of however many people watch his content. So there'd be various different ways you can structure it. But notice most of the other ways of structuring it, you would have to start with a lower number, and it might be an unacceptably low number. And I get that, but that's why you can fundamentally bring this back to it was a debate about the number, because all of these different systems can be made into an equivalent number. And if you don't like it, it's because you think that starting rate, that 20 plus plus was unacceptable, as opposed to that 50 minus minus. So that's what I think is the interesting economics of this, the chance to look at the different ways of structuring pay, how they can be made into equivalent expected values, but it's not appropriate to make them equivalent expected values. You need to make them equivalent risk-adjusted expected values, and how you can frame them differently to potentially to make the same thing look different, if you are so inclined. Let me just check. Gene, I don't know, you've been watching this play out as well, I think.
Yeah.
I know the interesting part of this is much more throwing mud, who's right, who's wrong. So I've clung on to perhaps the least interesting part, but it is the part where we can potentially give a different take, and everyone's giving very similar takes. So I like giving a different take on this. What's your take on the remuneration discussion?
Well, I mean, I was amazed at just the level of it. Really, I mean, the amount of money that's in that the DailyWire had to offer was extraordinary. I didn't realize that. I mean, Crowder was such a, had such a huge audience that was so monetizable. I mean, I guess it makes sense now that, I mean, they're watching Crowder and DailyWire rather than Fox or CNN increasingly. So I think, yeah, that's what really stood out to me. I was concerned about the motives of Crowder. I mean, I think it's been widely reported that perhaps he's looking at setting up his own rival channel to DailyWire. And recording a phone call wasn't really cool. So, yeah, I wasn't happy with that. But one point I would make, and I wonder if this was part of what his concern was, that the DailyWire is wanting to have all the copyright, the IP in what he produces while he's at the DailyWire. And I mean, Crowder might have a different view of what that's worth, the value of that, and he may want to control that. He may have some pride. He feels ownership in his work. So do you think that was part of how legitimate a concern is that, John, and how does that fit in with your model, the fact that the IP is potentially of value?
Well, I mean, that's I like these discussions. It's not too relevant to our previous discussion. The previous one was just assume there's revenue. How do you link that revenue to your wage? You could have it entirely unlinked, so your wage is just fixed, or you could have it linked in one of several different ways. And the IP is just a thing that people are going to assume has revenue attached to it, right? It either has value or it doesn't. If it doesn't have value, then who cares who owns it? If it has value, then obviously it's a part of that discussion of how you monetize it, and then how you share in the benefits of that money. Look, I think normally if you're a content creator on a channel, it's normally the channel that owns that content. Like when actors act in movies, they don't get to own a piece of that movie. It's it's whoever produces the content gets to own that. But I actually don't think that's fundamentally Stephen's concern. I think Brett here, I think, summarizes ably the concern that Crowder had, which was this point of penalizing people for being kicked off platforms, effectively makes the DailyWire the enforcer of the big tech rules. Which, look, I think there's some truth to this. Kind of the question that has to come back is, what's the alternative? I mean, it's these big tech platforms do create a revenue stream. So, I mean, I guess one option is just all alternative media just refuses to go on YouTube or Facebook. I note that Crowder is on YouTube. He's a massive channel on YouTube. He doesn't refuse to go on. So everyone kind of has to play this game. It's unfortunate. And I wish there were more options out there. Best of luck to Rumble and the others. But at the moment, the truth is that these platforms do create value, right? If you can have your content on those platforms, it adds revenue. And then you just go back to this issue of remuneration. It's just the issue of, all right, so there's revenue coming in. How do you link it to your wage? And I guess you could say, and Crowder says this, all right, well, maybe it should be unlinked. Just pay a fixed wage. All right, but then that number is going to be lower, significantly lower, right? Because they're not only just with the expected value, like Crowder was going to be paid somewhere between 20 and 50. So the expected value would have to be somewhere in between it, but it would probably be somewhere towards the lower end, because not only do you have to take the average, expect the weighted average between them, you have to factor in the risk adjustment, because you're now asking DailyWire to take all the risk and you want to take none of the risk. All right, so you could find a wage that could be offered with this same risk adjusted expected value, but it would be much lower. And it's not clear that many people would actually want that. I mean, it's what I find interesting here is if they showed up and just offered Crowder, say, 25 million over 4 years, I think you'd probably be equally offended by that. That's, unimpacted by anything else, no incentive pay. So I'm not sure anyone else would want that either. I think most people in the industry actually want some amount of incentive pay. And the truth is, the uncomfortable truth, and this is just the observation of reality, not a preference. The observation of reality is having your content on YouTube and Facebook and Apple and Spotify has value. It creates revenue. So the only remaining question is how you link that revenue back to the remuneration of the worker. Do you link it at all, or do you link it a little bit, or do you link it entirely? And what we had is a step system. Interesting here, Eddie said the idea of base pay plus bonuses would have been better. Look, I suspect it probably would have played a lot better. The interesting thing for mine is it's exactly the same. Like mathematically, financially, economically, every way with the amount of money gets in your bank, it's the same. Like 50 with penalties to take it down to 20, or 20 with bonuses that take you up to 50, leave you paid the same amount for the same reasons. But I suspect if they did 20 with bonuses, a lot of people who are offended by the penalties would go, oh, that's okay. All right, 20 base pay plus penalties plus bonuses if you can expand your reach onto extra platforms. But if that's okay, then what's wrong with the penalties? Other than the word penalty starts with the letter P, I guess, or I mean, it just sounds different. So I find that an odd one. Let's see, the straight commission is fair. All right, so that's the pure variable way. You reap what you sow. Yes, look, I mean, all of these options can be made to be fair depending on the percentages. And pretty much anyone would accept any of them depending on the value you put on them, right? You can make all of them equal as risk-adjusted expected value. You just might have to change the numbers a lot. So a straight-up commission, by the way, Steve Crowder said he'd be happy with a straight-up commission model. The issue there is now the content creator is taking on all the risk. So if you get kicked off channels, you have zero income, right? If not as many people watch you, then your wage can fluctuate up and down. So if you do really well, great. But how does that work for new people in the industry, for people who are still building their audience? I mean, we don't have a lot of people watching this podcast. If my wage was fixed to the number of people watching us here right now, I wouldn't be eating tonight. Thankfully, ATA pays me anyway, and so I'm able to do this. So look, all of them could be fair depending on the percentage, but all of them can be made to be equivalent, I guess, is my underlying point. And if they can all be made to be equivalent, that means the issue is simply if people are unhappy with it, it's because the number's too low. Fundamentally, you could find a high enough number. If Crowder started on 100 million and with bonuses, if he got seen by more platforms, or 200 million plus bonuses if he was on more platforms, eventually it would be acceptable. The risk-adjusted expected value would be equivalent.
John, I'm just wondering, is there an optimal contracting arrangement in this situation, or are you arguing that there's a whole range of options? Because wouldn't some sort of incentive be in both parties' interest? Because, I mean, Crowder could use that as a signal of his ability. He backs himself. He's confident. So, okay, I'll take less compensation guaranteed and I'll have more at risk because I'm really backing myself and I want a good deal on the amount that's at, I want a good percentage take. And then DailyWire goes, okay, well, that means that, okay, we minimize the amount we're guaranteed to pay. And then if there is if we are winning, if we're doing well, then okay, we're happy to pay you some more. Could you see that as an optimal contract arrangement? Or are you saying there's just a whole array of possible arrangements that are equally optimal, depending on preferences?
No, you're quite right to pick me up on this. Like, I mean to say that any different structure, you could find a dollar amount that would create an equivalent risk-adjusted expected value. That shouldn't be taken to imply, and perhaps I don't think I mentioned this yet, so it's a good thing to clarify. That doesn't mean they're going to all be equal, because some of the numbers you're going to have to create to end up with an equal risk-adjusted expected value are going to be absurd or very unacceptable to one side or the other. So obviously the contract that is optimal, well, one criteria for it is it had to be acceptable to both sides, right? A contract is going to be a good one if both sides accept it. Otherwise, it's not going to be a contract. It's just going to be an idea that one person had and the other person rejected. In terms of the optimalness of it, the interesting point you raised there is, we haven't got onto this yet, but there's probably a good argument to be made that it's at least some amount should be incentive pay. And the reason for that is to try and solve the issue of moral hazard. So we didn't really get into it here, but there is a potential moral hazard problem where if you're paid unrelated to your performance or unrelated to the revenue you bring in, there's a risk that you're going to not care very much about how much revenue you bring in for your company. Right? You can get your contract, pocket the money, and then you can, if the mood strikes, act in a way that is very counter to the interests of the business you're working for. So that's moral hazard, right? That's that moral hazard problem. And it's in both parties' interest to solve the moral hazard problem, because if you can solve it, that creates more value that can then be shared between both. Right? So if you can solve the moral hazard problem, you could end up with the company, because they solved the moral hazard problem, are willing to pay more. And the recipient, as long as they weren't planning on screwing over the company, because they solved the moral hazard problem, they get to receive more. So you could end up with a win-win outcome by fixing the moral hazard, by introducing appropriate incentive pay. Look, there is a very deep literature on the nuance of different types of incentive pay. It can get quite messy. And the other thing is, there's not going to be an answer to this, because one element is going to be simply the preferences of both sides of the contract. Some people will have a preference for one type, and that will mean to get them to switch preferences, you would have to offer them such a high, an advantageous contract in the other style, that other style of contract may become hard to get agreement on. And this could be what's happening here. I mean, this almost certainly is what's happening here. There's a difference in a preference of style of contracts, and if Crowder wants DailyWire to give him the sort of contract he wants, the number's going to be so low that he wouldn't accept it. And if Crowder wants DailyWire to give him the sort of contract, the reverse, then if DailyWire wants Crowder to accept their approach, the number's going to have to be so high that DailyWire won't pay it. So that looks like there's the fundamental reason for the fallout. But then the fundamental reason for the fallout is about money, right? It's about the total structure and size of that money to make it fit. They don't agree on how to make it fit, right? So the amount to be paid is too high for what DailyWire is willing to pay. Sorry, that was I started fumbling for words at the end, but I think that's the look. You're right. There is a preferred structure, and it's going to be different for different people depending on their preferences. Clearly, we didn't find the preferred structure for Crowder and DailyWire. But I think the interesting thing to note is there is always an equivalent risk-adjusted expected value from doing a different style. And the fundamental question is, what is the relationship between the revenue and the pay of the person? By the way, the other issue to factor in, the other solution to moral hazard is performance reviews. Right? So a lot of people listening in you'll have jobs, you'll have a pay. And if you suck at your job enough, you'll get negative performance reviews, and that may result in not getting a wage increase, potentially getting a wage cut, potentially getting fewer hours, potentially at some point getting fired. So there is at some stage a feedback mechanism often between your revenue and your wage, which is obviously necessary to make the contract a win-win contract. Just checking what the other comments are coming in. More about ego than money with these celebrities. Yeah. Look, I actually think I think Steve Crowder is probably worth more. You made the point that this $50 million is a lot of money. I think DailyWire could have got revenue sufficiently exceeding that to be worth a better offer. Or perhaps worded a different way, maybe 50 is right, but the penalties should have been smaller. I think the the risk-adjusted expected value of the contract should have been higher, right? So I do think they came in with a pretty low number, and I half suspect that bruised Stephen Crowder's ego. So probably I can't see into their hearts. This debate is pointless. Yes, well, in some ways it is, except for the chance to learn about risk-adjusted expected value, which is what we all want to do on a Tuesday evening. The purpose of any offer would be censorship and punishment. I think it's self-evident that the purpose of the offer is to make money. Like, I don't think DailyWire hires people with the hope of, oh, yes, we get to lose money, but if only we get to censor them. I really struggle to think that that's true. And to be honest, I struggle to think that anyone seriously thinks it's true. Like, I mean, their goal is to make money. So their goal is to come up with a contract that is structured in such a way that they will pay less money than they bring in over the course of the contract. If the Star brings in less revenue, then they would want to decrease the pay. I can understand that, but that's because they're profit maximizers. They could just be evil. Hates conservatives, loves neocons. I don't really know what people mean by neocons anymore. I think that just used to mean left-wing people who like war. But yeah, look, on brand for Shapiro, I don't know. I do note that there seems to be enough arguments between the DailyWire people, but maybe they're all neocons. I don't know. I mean, I haven't actually seen all of their reactions to a war lately. I do think Shapiro's too ready to go to war. I disagree with him on those sort of things. I don't know about Walsh and the others. Oh, sorry, I already did that one. Definitely needed to be worded better. I saw nothing wrong with it, but obviously many others did. Yeah, well, and that's part of it. This is a criticism made for DailyWire by a few other people, and that is that maybe they didn't fundamentally do anything wrong, but people do react to emotions. So you could factor that in. It's okay to make money. Indeed, yes. It's okay to want to make money. But anyway, we've done that one. That was my deep dive. I've taken too much of your time, Gene. I apologize. Thank you for the comments coming in. You can keep them coming in. We can have a look at them at the end. But that was my take. The takeaway here is you can always find an equivalent risk-adjusted expected value. It just means sometimes you won't be able to make both sides like the same one. But that's it from me. So I will now hand over the conch. Gene, what is interesting that's happened in the world lately from your point of view?
Yes, thanks, John. And we might have to continue this in another session because this is I think this is a meaty topic too. And I'll use a different mic next time because I think there's a bit too much noise on this mic for some reason. Anyway, what I've been following is this story about China. So it was reported last week that for the first time since I think it was 1962 or something. So when China had their was it the Cultural Revolution, and they had the Great Leap Forward, and it's the first reduction in population since then, and a fall in the population by 850,000 people. So out of 1.4 billion people, you might think, well, whatever, that's less than 0.1%. But what this heralds is the decline, the trend decline in the Chinese population. India taking over as the largest country, concerns about the long-term stability of China. What does this mean for their economy? What does it mean for the level of investment required and whether they can keep people employed? There are all sorts of questions that this raises because China really just did itself a great amount of damage with that one-child policy it instituted back in 1980 that kicked in then. And so they just don't have enough young people. And since they've lifted it, but their fertility rate's not recovering because people are used to the norm has been, well, let's just have one child. And also, there's also, I guess there's concerns about where China's going and the livability of China too. So people are not having additional children, and anyway, they probably couldn't have them quickly enough to deal with the demographic challenge they're facing. So there are all sorts of projections now of China's population by the end of this century falling to 700 to 800 million, or even lower. So this is potentially a big issue for China and for the global economy. And the way the Economist wrote it up was that not since 1962, after millions died in a man-made famine triggered by Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, had the country recorded a shrinking of the population. So, yeah, just a huge story that's going to have implications over the coming decades, because there are some forecasts. I mean, there are commentators like Peter Zeihan and also Paul Krugman. He's talked about the economic consequences of this. This could mean a sluggish economy. People have been talking about, well, look at what's happened with Japan. And if you don't have a growing population, then that affects the economic dynamism in the country. You can see that in China. They're getting old before they get rich. In the 2080s, so this old age dependency ratio, the number of people aged 65 and over to those of working age, 15 to 64, that's going up from about 20 to 100. That's going to go up to around 90 to 100. So you're going to have almost as many old people as people of working age. Huge problems for China. Concerns about the stability of the country. I mean, but of course, I mean, it is it's a terrible regime. So I mean, if this is something that they can't manage, and then that regime topples, then I mean that may well be a good thing. So just wait and see what happens. But this is going to be the big story, one of the big stories for the long-term evolution of the global economy, I think.
Yeah, I let's see if I can get this right. Yeah. See if I can get our faces back on the same side. No. Yep. Okay. Look, I think that last point is certainly true. The idea that people looking back on this moment or this decade in the future, I think the arc of this moment is the trajectory of China. And whether it's a continued upward rise or whether they are about to run into a wall, that's going to be one of the important moments we are living through now. And sometimes when you're living through moments, other things can seem bigger because they're a bit more exciting or flashy in the moment. But looking back, we are living through a fascinating moment of potential shifts in terms of geopolitical power and economic power around the world. Look, I think I think China's in trouble. But I'm not sure if it's because of the aging population thing. I've got a bit of an alternative view on this because I'm always trying to be contrary, but I'm not just doing it only to be contrary. Look, I think China's in trouble because they've stepped away from Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin's approach of basically market capitalism, right? They still have to call it socialism to keep other people happy, but they basically embrace the idea of market competition and easy to start a business, easy to keep your proceeds, relatively low taxes, low regulation in business. So as long as you stayed out of dangerous trigger industries, they had a fairly robust competitive market economy for a while. And they're stepping away from that. And I think that's a grave mistake. And I think that's going to end up constraining their growth. They're going to try to artificially inflate the growth to try and get back to the numbers they want. And they're going to do it in stupid ways that probably end up imploding their country. So look, I think they're in for a bad next decade unless they change direction. So the good thing about that is my diagnosis is their problem is self-inflicted. And if they stop shooting themselves in the foot, their foot will stop hurting. So there's a positive to that. It's not inevitable, right? China has changed directions drastically several times in the past, right? I mean, when they went from the nationalist period to Mao Zedong, they basically embraced one of the most radical, crazy, extreme communist experiments the world has ever seen. That was a massive change in direction. And when they did that, it led to the single greatest ever loss of life in human history. Right, some 60 million people or something like that as a response of the ridiculously stupid policies they introduced. That's a massive change. Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin come into power, massive changes. They go from the most crazy communist experiment to embracing markets and competition. They do a complete 180 and they bring hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, like hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, more than any NGO has ever brought out of poverty, better than any charity has ever done. So that's a massive 180. And now they changed directions again towards, it's hard to know what you want to call Xi Jinping's approach to politics. You could call it some interesting mix of nationalism and socialism, and maybe put those words closer and closer together and see if you find another word that describes it. But I don't think it's a pretty outcome, and I think they're on a bad track. But they could change direction again, right? That's the hope for China. It's not inevitable. On the aging thing, what you say is, it's very right. They're getting old before they get rich. They're going to have a lot of people retiring or of retirement age, and fewer people of working age. That means their GDP growth is going to have to go down. But note that it's GDP per capita that really matters. And it's the quality of life over your life cycle that matters. So the big question is, how are they going to, what system are they going to have to pay for the people as they retire? And I think that's an interesting one for the whole world to grapple with, because the whole world is getting older. We're all having more retirees, more people over 65 or 67, fewer working people. So all countries have to deal with it. China has to deal with it a bit quicker than the rest of us. But I think one of the dangers of an aging population is if you have a welfare state, you've got fewer and fewer productive working people and more people relying on the government. How does that add up? Right? If you have a socialized health system and a large welfare state, how do you add that up? A decade goes by, fewer workers, that means fewer taxpayers and more health and welfare spending. Another decade goes by, fewer taxpayers, more health and welfare spending. How do you add that up? Right? So this is the danger that a lot of the countries in the world face, including Australia. And there's not much getting out of that problem without directly addressing the health and welfare policies. Now, China doesn't have, for all being called socialist and communist, they don't actually have big government health and welfare policies. They still, a lot of people have to rely on their family and their personal savings. So what's interesting here, if China embraces, which they seem to be anyway now, if they embrace greater socialism and nationalized health and more welfare, then I don't know how they make that work. I don't know how they square that circle. Their budget's screwed. Yeah. But they haven't yet, so there is a way out of this, and that is if their families continue to pay for the older people in their families, and people continue to save. Drastically high savings rate in China, and has been for a long time. If they save and their families look after their elderly, I can't see any reason why this isn't sustainable. So this is the big question: is China getting old before they get rich? Could that be to their benefit? Because they got old before they got rich, they never introduce a big welfare state. If that's the case, maybe they'll manage it. The big question is, how is Europe going to manage it?
Yeah, massive or Australia or the US, yeah.
Well, Australia's in a slightly better, US has got better demographics, so they're in a slightly better situation, and they also have they haven't nationalized their healthcare as much. Australia also has, we start from lower levels of debt, which is nice, and we've got a semi-private retirement system and a semi-private health system. So we're only half screwed. Still, if you extrapolate far enough into the future, Australia still faces a problem. But we're still decades away from the pointy end of that problem. Europe, I think, is going to be the place that's really having to face up to this issue in the near term. And I don't know what their solution is.
Yeah. John, just one final point. I know we're near time, but you mentioned the cost of healthcare systems. And one thing that struck me as an extraordinary bit of news, I should have mentioned it earlier, the PM has announced that they're looking at Medicare and, funding of primary healthcare of the GPs. And I mean, what does that mean exactly? And is this going back to, I remember when I think it was the Abbott government and Joe Hockey's first budget, they tried to do something along to address that. I think was it the co-payment, and that was incredibly unpopular.
Sorry, I don't know. I missed some of that. Can you say what's the policy they've just announced?
Well, it's all very vague. I mean, the PM's announced that, okay, we recognise that there's problems with funding GPs, and there's not enough money in the system in Medicare at the moment to support GPs. People aren't getting the primary health care they need, and there's all these people with complex needs. He's foreshadowing some sort of change to try to get things under control. There's this concern about, he's also talking about how a lot of people are going to the state emergency departments, the state hospitals, because they can't find bulk billing GPs. Albanese's foreshadowing some shake-up of Medicare, but he hasn't provided any details because there's a problem there. And I think this is what you were suggesting before, that if we have these welfare states and these public health systems, which a lot of people support, and there are sound equity reasons for it, but the cost of it is just yeah, it's a huge challenge for the governments, and I mean we're going to be grappling with that. So I think maybe I'll look into that a bit further, and we can try to chat about that in the future.
Yeah, no, keen to. I mean, this is one of the reasons the government releases the intergenerational report every 5 years. And one of the things that shows each time is you extrapolate forward health costs. Health costs rise faster than GDP. So the health costs of the country, and which makes sense, right? I mean, as they should, quite frankly. I mean, as you get richer, it makes sense. It's a luxury good. You'd spend a growing percentage of your wealth on maintaining your health. That's understandable. But a significant portion of that health cost is government health cost. If that's growing faster than GDP and faster than tax revenue, then it's going to create some sort of budgetary squeeze at some point. Now, there's ways to square that circle, but they might not be pretty. And this is an ongoing problem. Now, it's interesting that they've raised that. I mean, the health sector is in need of reform long-term in Australia. We could probably free ride for another decade or two, but the responsible thing to do would be to fix it earlier than later to get it on a sustainable footing. It's always difficult politics, though. Right? I mean, it's the stuff that they need to do. It's not obvious it'll help you win votes. And politicians, I'm sure they'd like to do the right thing if they can, but they're far more interested in winning votes if they have to choose between those two goals in life. Because if they don't win votes, they're very quickly an ex-politician. And they normally like to stay a current politician. So it's difficult. I wonder if they're complaining about lack of bulk billing doctors, it sounds like they might just be offering to put more money into the system to re-incentivize bulk billing doctors. Otherwise, we are drifting towards a copay system naturally just through the lack of bulk billing doctors.
Yeah. It's a proposed blended funding model. I just pulled it up. So I mean, I'd like to see more details, but it's a proposed blended funding model that would open primary care delivery to nurses, pharmacists, and other allied health professionals who would work together in teams, the biggest change in Medicare history. Okay, so they're trying to deal with all of the health, try and stop people from going to GPs, go and see your pharmacist or a nurse or whoever. And yeah, that's a way of relieving the pressure on the system. So that's a way that they can do it without introducing some sort of co-payment to manage demand, which was the idea of the Abbott government, which was incredibly unpopular. So they've got to try and do something different. And I don't know whether it'll work. But
it might be worth looking into this again next week. As you said earlier, we are hitting up against that hour mark. Indeed, we've gone over that hour mark, so we should probably wrap it up. But I mean, it could be worth doing a deeper dive next week. But we'll see what happens between now and then. See what our most interesting topics are by the time we get there. Gene, thank you very much for joining us this week, and I hope you'll be back.
Thanks, John. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and thanks to everyone in the audience. Yeah, great comments and questions. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, there were some good ones coming through. And can I just remind everyone, 7 o'clock Queensland time, 8 o'clock New South Wales, Victoria time every Tuesday. Well, most Tuesdays. I took a month's break over Christmas, as you may have noticed. But all the Tuesdays going forward, this is ATA's EconChat, brought to you by the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. Please go out, find our Facebook page, find our YouTube channel, give us a follow. G, do you have any social medias you want to give a shout out to?
My podcast, Economics Explored, which is on the Apple Podcasts and Spotify, etc. So yeah, please check it out.
All right. Thank you all, and see you all next week. Hey DJ, what do you think of the budget?
Budget naughty.
Yeah, budget naughty. Hey DJ, what do you think of the budget?
Budget naughty.
Yeah, budget naughty.